Good morning, everyone. Thank you for tuning in to Voice of Reason Boston. This morning, our special guest, Rahsaan Hall, is the director of the Racial Justice Program for the American Civil Liberties and Union of Massachusetts. Good morning, Rahsaan. How are you today?
I'm well. Good morning.
Thank you for coming in today. And for our viewers and listeners who are listening in, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, please?
Sure. So as you said at the outset, I'm the director of the Racial Justice Program for the ACLU of Massachusetts. We are a nonprofit civil rights and civil liberties law reform organization. We are most historically known for our work around protection of the First Amendment, freedom of speech,
Right.
freedom of privacy, but we also are engaged in work around equality, police accountability, voting rights. And so I've been at the ACLU for a little over 2 years, well actually it'll be 3 years come August, but before that I was the Deputy Director of the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights and Economic Justice here in Boston. And prior to that I was a prosecutor, a state prosecutor here in Suffolk County for about 8 years. In between being a prosecutor and attorney, somewhere along the lines, God called me to the ordained ministry, and so I'm also an ordained reverend within the African Methodist Episcopal Church.
That's wonderful.
Yeah, and an itinerant elder, so I had to go back to school and get my Master of Divinity degree from Andover Newton Theological School, and so I'm a part of the ministerial staff at St. Paul AME Church in Cambridge. So that's a little bit about me. I'm not a Massachusetts native. I was born and raised in Denver, Colorado, but came out here for law school and got stuck.
Okay, wow. And we actually have something in common. I also was a victim witness advocate for about 4 years for the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office. If you can tell me, what was your experience like while working for the DA's office?
It was a very interesting experience. I think in order for me to really talk about that experience in context, I have to back up a little bit.
Right.
When I was in law school, I really didn't have a solid concept of what the practice of law was. It was just something that I felt I needed to do because, you know, you graduate from college and you say, well, there's not a lot for political science majors to do, so let me go back to school. And so while in law school, one of the things that captured my imagination was the O.J. Simpson trial and watching Johnny Cochran in the courtroom, seeing him do what he did, the way that he handled that case, and beginning to learn about the intersection between the criminal justice system and civil rights issues. And so while in law school, I became very passionate about civil rights work and criminal law and figured I was going to be a criminal defense attorney. My first job out of law school was the public defender's office down in Dade County, Florida, which is Miami. I was there for about a year, but then came back to Massachusetts, and while looking for work, I had this opportunity presented to me to work for the Suffolk County District Attorney's Office, and I hesitated. Ralph Martin, who was the district attorney at the time, an African-American man, knew my father and reached out to him and said, I hear your son's back in town. Maybe he would like a job at working as an assistant district attorney.
Right.
And, you know, my father, knowing me and my worldview and perspective on issues around criminal law, said no, but I'm going to send him to you anyway because he needs a job. So I went and I met with Ralph, and in that interview I expressed my concerns about being a black man in a position where I am sending other black people to jail, particularly in light of the gross racial disparities that exist in the system and the overwhelming number of black folks that have been locked up. And I expressed that to him, and he acknowledged that and said he had the similar experience, particularly in his role as the district attorney. But what he said to me in that meeting was that the people who are the victims of crimes, the communities that are suffering from violence, deserve to have you represent them in the courtroom and to be a representative of the Commonwealth. And it's something that I knew and understood, but didn't have a great appreciation for it until that time. And so I started in around 2000, February of 2000, I started out in Dorchester District Court, handling low-level crimes, misdemeanors, and worked my way up. Was there for about 3 years, and then I was promoted to Superior Court, where I handled more significant and challenging cases, including gang-involved shootings,
Right.
drug trafficking cases, and homicide cases. And so my experience for those 8 years that I was there was a challenging one, in that I was interacting with people at a point in their lives where things were probably at their worst.
Exactly.
Right. Also dealing with the victims of crimes who lived in this complicated reality of being a victim, but also of crime, but also being a victim of racism and structural and institutional racism and white supremacy, and how that played out in our communities and how communities were over-policed. I also, never thought that I would be in relation with police officers, right? My first day on the job was coming from this mindset of seeing police as the problems in our community. And my first day on the job, I'm in the basement of Dorchester District Court, where the DA's office was, and there's all these police officers standing around with guns on their hips and coffee and donuts in their hands.
And they're like regular
stereotypical
people at the end of the day.
Exactly, and that was one of the things that kind of disabused me of some of the notions that I had about police. It also reaffirmed some of the notions that I had about police, because I saw what they did and how they did it. But I also gained a greater appreciation for the complexity of their lives as well. And I just think being in that office gave me a great opportunity to meet and interact with some very amazing people throughout the city of Boston who are doing great work in the community, in the courtrooms, helping children, helping young people, working with victims of crime, but also working with people who have perpetrated crimes and trying to get them back on the right path. And I think that experience has helped shape my view and perspective on what I call the criminal legal system, because of some of the injustices I struggle to call the criminal justice system. But that work, that experience informs the work that I do now as a civil rights advocate.
Yeah, it's funny that you say that, because I too, when I was working at the district attorney's office, I started at Dorchester District Court. And, even though you're a young African American woman working in the city of Boston, there are certain things that you've never experienced or seen. So it's kind of like a culture shock.
Right.
And you go in thinking about, well, on the outside, it's easy to say, oh, all they do is just lock people up, especially people of color. But when you're looking at the victim, on the other hand, the issues that they're going, what is there else to do if they're calling the police to come and get the person who harmed them? Your job is to go ahead and get that person that committed that crime to be held accountable. And oftentimes you speak to these victims, they're in a place of shock, they're in a place of despair, and they're usually, when they don't get the help, it kind of causes a cycle to happen again of trauma. And earlier this month we had director of program of Boston Commission Health. His name was Mark Scott, and he was talking about how trauma, when people are in trauma and they don't have, the kind of help that they need, and services that they need, it causes a domino effect in the community, and the community becomes this cycle of life where people see things and don't say anything. But working at the DA's office, I've had the opportunity to work with many different kind of people, interacted with so many police officers, like you said, in a way that I've never have before. And you see there are some wonderful officers, and there are a little bit of bad apples out there. But I think there's plenty of good cops that outweigh the bad, that are willing to help the community. But sometimes the community is not receptive to the help for their own personal reason, and I get it. And but I went to Roxbury as well. I worked at Roxbury District Court, kind of like the same, but a little bit intense because it's one of the second busiest court. And then I had the privilege to go to Superior Court in the major felony unit, like you stated, which is more of a high impacted crime cases. And it's crazy how different communication and different help that you can provide to people. And it's just I wish that in the DA's office there were more programs to help or to be given to these people that are seeking help. And some of them don't want them, and I understand that because they don't like being in the court system, and a lot of them don't know what it entails when you go through the court process. So,
yeah, I mean, one of the things I think about, the way that our communities are policed and the resources that are available to them, I think the challenge that we have is that we struggle with a lack of imagination and a lack of resources, because the scenario that you gave where somebody is a victim of a crime and they call the police to get help in that situation, when you present people with one tool to address a particular problem, they are going to understand that that tool is the way to solve the problem. And it's not until you present them with a variety of options and tools that we can then begin to look at how to approach the issues of crime and substance use disorder and mental health issues and domestic violence and human trafficking in our community in a way that is different. I think it's important for me to talk about the work that I do from the perspective of abolition, and when I say abolition, I mean abolition of prisons and abolition of police forces. And I know for some people that is a very challenging notion to grapple with, because folks are going to say, well, what are you talking about? You're going to close all the prisons, let everybody out, and have no police? That's just ridiculous. But when I talk about this, it's an invitation for people to think about envisioning a world where we don't need prisons to deal with the ills of society, envisioning a world where the police are not the first line of defense to deal with social ills. And it's not something that happens immediately. From my perspective, it is something that we cast the vision for, and then we begin to build the systems and institutions that replace the ones that exist now. And so for folks who will say, well, that's just ridiculous, there was a point in this time in this country's history where the notion of abolishing slavery seemed ridiculous too, because that was the cornerstone of this nation's infrastructure and its economy, uncompensated labor of enslaved Africans. Insurance industries built up off of that, trade routes built up off of that, transportation built up off of that. And so to say that we would have to abolish slavery was antithetical to the very understanding of what this notion of what this nation's economic engines were at the time, but we ultimately arrived there. And so when I talk about, the things that need to happen in our community, it's with an eye towards dismantling the systems of oppression and the systems of social control that result in so many black and brown people being arrested and charged and thrown into jail. And so is there a space for restorative justice where people are held accountable in community? Because I think there's a difference between punishment and accountability. I can throw you in a cage and lock you up to punish you. That doesn't necessarily mean that you will be held accountable, right? Because an individual never has to reconcile with what brought them to that place in their life that they would commit that crime, or then even begin to understand the impact that their crime has had on people. So when we talk about law enforcement and the way that it happens in our communities, if we keep giving everyone the hammer and saying this is the tool, then everyone's going to get nailed.
Okay. So that's interesting. So what do you think as a community we can do to make certain things or certain changes to when we don't like certain things? Because I know one of the things that you're part of is making a difference. It's called Difference a DA Makes.
What a difference a DA makes.
What a difference DA makes. And we have a lot of people running, I shouldn't say a lot, but we have a couple of people that are running for the DA's office. What is one of the things as a community we can look for when we're trying to select a DA for the Suffolk County of Boston to see, what is it that we can do and we can look for in order to get someone to see the change that is needed in the community?
That's a great question. I think it's important to talk about what a district attorney does, because
Right.
we've had the privilege of working in that office and
Right.
understanding what it is they do. But a lot of listeners probably have no idea what the district attorney does. They see Law and Order on TV and understand that as the scope and magnitude of what district attorneys do, but their offices are responsible for the prosecution of criminal cases. Their priorities are not just to get convictions, or should not just be to get convictions, but it's about doing justice. And so whenever someone is charged with a crime by the police, that case then comes into the courts, and it is the district attorney's office, through the assistant district attorneys or their line prosecutors, that prosecute that case. And the way they prosecute that case has impact on the way a community feels it is being provided for or dealt with by its government. And so there are a lot of cases that come through our courts on a daily basis. An overwhelming majority of those cases are handled in the district court. We received some information and for Suffolk County, which is Boston, Chelsea, Winthrop, and Revere. 96% of the cases between 2013 and 2014 were in district court. So these are low-level cases. These are misdemeanors. The difference between a misdemeanor and a felony is something that carries a sentence over 2.5 years and can be served in state prison, whereas misdemeanors are sentences under that are served in the House of Correction, which is, the equivalent to the jail that the sheriff runs. But the prosecutors also are responsible for making bail requests when somebody is accused of a crime. The purpose of bail is to make sure people come back on the next day, not to keep the community safe. There's a separate hearing for that called a dangerousness hearing. But the prosecutor makes the bail request. Does the judge set the bail? Yes. But my 8 years as a prosecutor, never did a judge set a bail when I didn't request it.
Okay.
And also, I defined the range of the bail request, right? If I'm asking for $100,000 bail, the judge is going to make a decision within that $100,000, right? As opposed to $100 bail, the judge can make a decision within that. Prosecutors or the district attorney's office is also responsible for impacting or influencing criminal law reform. We just passed a major comprehensive criminal law reform bill. It came through the legislature and it was signed by the governor that changes a lot of things like mandatory minimum sentences, or raising the age of juvenile jurisdiction, or closing the loopholes for people who have criminal records to allow them to get back on their feet and be a productive member of society, or diverting people out of court into drug treatment programs. All of those things were included, as well as many more. But the district attorneys stood against a lot of those reforms.
Right.
And so they have this immense power to influence the legislature and the law. And the question that we have to ask is, do they use it for good, or do they use it to perpetuate these stale notions of tough on crime tactics that keep our communities, Black and Latino and poor communities, over-policed and over-criminalized? And so we have to understand what DAs do, and then I think we can begin to have a conversation about what are the types of things that we want to look for in a district attorney candidate.
Okay. Thank you for that. What we're going to do right now is going to take a short break, and then we'll come back and continue to have this conversation. We will continue to have our special guest, Rahsaan Hall, talk about what a DA makes, what a difference a DA makes.
Yeah, so I think we kind of left off talking about what it is a district attorney does. And so they are the chief law enforcement officer for state prosecutors in a particular county. You mentioned that there were a couple folks running for DA here in Suffolk, or not here in Suffolk County, we're actually in Norfolk County right now. But in Suffolk County, that is the race that has garnered the most attention. But I think it's important to understand this in its full context. In the last 20 years, 77% of district attorney races have been uncontested. We did some polling recently at the ACLU, and we learned that 4 in 10 Massachusetts voters did not know that the district attorney was an elected official. So this is not a poll of Massachusetts residents. This is a poll of people who say, I vote, I go out to the polls on a regular basis, and 4 out of 10 of them did not know that the DA was an elected official. And that's in part because there are rarely contested elections. Like I said, that stat in the last 20 years, 77% have been uncontested.
Is there a way to change that or make people more aware of who's running and why they should be paying attention to certain things like this?
Absolutely, and that's what our campaign, What a Difference a DA Makes, is all about. In our polling, we found out that 81% of people were more likely to pay attention to a DA race once they knew more about what DAs do. And so this year, in Massachusetts, there's 14 counties throughout the state. Of those 14 counties, there are 11 district attorney districts. There's a couple of districts that get combined together, like the Cape and Islands.
Okay.
So Barnstable, Orleans, Nantucket counties all get combined into one county, or out in the western part of the state, there's the Northwestern District, which is Hampshire and Franklin counties. And so there are 11 counties, or district attorney counties, or districts, and of those 11, 6 of them have a contested race. This is unprecedented. This, as far as I can tell, has never happened. Not never, but it has not happened in a long time in Massachusetts where there are this many contested district attorney elections. And so the Suffolk County race is an open race. The sitting district attorney, Dan Conley, is not seeking re-election. And so there are 6 candidates in that race. 5 of them are running in the Democratic primary: Shannon McAuliffe, Evandro Carvalho, Greg Henning, Rachel Rollins, Linda Champion, and then there's one candidate who is unenrolled, Michael Maloney. So September 4th is the primary election, so that will determine who comes out as the Democratic candidate, and then the unenrolled candidate, Michael Maloney, will go head-to-head in the general election in November. In Plymouth County, which is Brockton, Plymouth, Kingston, kind of southeastern Massachusetts, there is an incumbent district attorney, Tim Cruz, who is a Republican, and he has a challenger by the name of John Bradley, who is running against him. That will go to the general election. In Middlesex County, the incumbent is Marion Ryan. She has a challenger named Donna Padalano. They're both running in the Democratic primary, so that September 4th election will determine who is the Middlesex DA. Worcester County, the incumbent is Joe Early, who is a Democrat, and he has a unenrolled challenger named Blake Rubin. And then in Hampshire County, or Hamden County, excuse me, which is Springfield, there is an incumbent, Tom Glennie, and he has a challenger. I believe her name is Michelle McNally. And then finally in Berkshire County, which is the furthest west you can go and still be in Massachusetts, the sitting district attorney, David Capeless, resigned so that his first assistant could be appointed district attorney, so he could run as an incumbent, which from our perspective is problematic because that undercuts the democratic process and gives an unfair advantage to one person who gets to be the incumbent. So Paul Cacavello is the current district attorney in Berkshire, and he has 2 challengers, a woman by the name of Andrea Harrington and another by the name of Judith Knight. So there are 6 district attorney races in the state of Massachusetts, and we haven't seen this much activity, but it goes to your point about, is there something that can be done? We'd like to claim a little credit for that because we launched our public education campaign back in December to raise awareness about the role, the power, and the influence of district attorneys, with the hopes that more people would get engaged and involved and pay attention to these races. We know that there were a couple of candidates that were recruited to run. After people had conversations with us, they went out and found candidates to run. So we were encouraging people to take part in the democratic process. There's also a national conversation that's happening. The election of really progressive district attorneys in Philadelphia, Larry Krasner, and in Cook County, Illinois, the city of Chicago, Kim Fox. These are conversations, these are events that are happening that are capturing people's imagination about how prosecution and how the criminal legal system can be transformed by these elected offices.
I think that's wonderful because when I was growing up, I don't believe I had that privilege to be in tuned in what was going around and anything about the district attorney's office. It's actually last 4 years I knew what the district attorney was about because of working there and
Right.
what goes into it and how much power they have. So for those who are tuning in, it's very important to look into your community to find out what it is that you're looking for when it comes to a candidate, what it is that they can provide your community. Because oftentimes, we've worked in the office, we're looking for diversity. Is there enough diversity? Sometimes you see these prosecutors on a case, and sometimes you wonder, do they even understand or have experience with people in the community? Education is good, but at the same time, do you have a connection? Do you see what the real problem is in order to help this individual so that it can stop reoccurring?
Absolutely. I think that is an excellent point. And if folks want to get more information about the race and about district attorneys, they can visit our website, which is www.dadifference.org. And that is the campaign's website. There are resources, there are explainer videos, there are blogs that help illuminate what it is district attorneys do and why it is important to have a progressive, reform-minded district attorney that can really change and transform this system so that communities that have historically been oppressed and disenfranchised and over-policed and over-criminalized do not continue to suffer from the same type of law enforcement practices that have perpetuated some of the problems. Because like we said, there are people who come into the system. We have a horrible recidivism rate in Massachusetts. 74% of the people who are serving sentences have prior convictions. And for people who are serving House of Correction sentences, those are kind of the lower level misdemeanor or lower level felony cases out of the district court, 43% of them have had a conviction within the last 3 years. So apparently what we're doing isn't working because
Right.
the people who are coming in are the same ones who have been there and they continue to cycle through. So we need to think about alternatives that funnel people away from the system. We need to be incarcerating fewer people because the amount of money that we spend is nearly 3 times what it costs to educate a student.
Right.
And so if we could redirect those resources into substance use treatment, mental health treatment, job training, and diversionary programs to make sure people have what it is that they need so that they are not committing crimes, the better served we are as a community. And the role of the district attorney is to help, from our perspective, is to help reduce the number of people who are prosecuted. It is to help divert people who are being prosecuted into programs. It's to cede some of the power that district attorneys have and wield sometimes unfairly back to the community, back to the people, so that they can have the systems and the help and the services that are going to best support the needs of those community and put them in a place where they're not suffering from the same cycles of violence and victimization and crime that you talked about earlier.
Yeah, I heard one program, you said there's a diversion program.
Right.
And I think that's only one program that I've ever heard while working in the criminal justice system, a program where they'll give you a certain amount of months not to commit any crime and then the case would be dismissed. Do you think there should be more programs like the diversion program?
Absolutely. And so there is formal diversion and informal diversion. Informal diversion is when the police arrest somebody and they get brought into court. The district attorney or the assistant district attorney who works for the DA has the discretion in many instances to look at the case and say, you know what, this is a simple case, or you know what, this was a misunderstanding, or you know what, although this was a violation of the law, what would serve the community best is if we dismiss this case and have this person go to a treatment program or have this person go do community service work. That's kind of informal diversion. But then there are also formal diversion programs like a drug court or a veterans court or a mental health court,
Right.
where people are given some sort of resolution to their case conditioned upon participation in a program that helps them get the things that they need so that they're not committing the same offenses. From my perspective, diversionary opportunities, both formal and informal, need to increase because we're spending too much money locking people up. We're spending too much money on just holding people without them receiving the benefit of any services. 97% of people who are serving sentences are ultimately coming home.
Right.
95% of people who are serving sentences are ultimately going to come home back to community. And the question we have to ask ourselves as a society is, what do we want those people to be equipped with when they re-enter back into society? Do we just want to throw them in a hole and let them sit there and not have the benefit of programming that is need specific,
Yeah.
right, or rehabilitative? Or do we want them to have the benefit of being, having some sort of therapy, having substance use treatment, getting some educational opportunities, job skills trainings, and then not being burdened with a criminal offender record that hampers them from getting a job? And so the more that we invest in people and holding them accountable, not just through punishment and detention, but through investing in them and having them reflect on and being in communication with the people in their community, the better served we are.
Do you think whomever the DA, whoever the new DA is, do you think that DA has the opportunity and can make more programs for individuals or people in the Commonwealth who are in the system?
So there are a couple of ways that the district attorney can do that. The DA, as an elected official, sets policy for that office.
Okay.
The funding that they receive through the state appropriation is largely limited to capital expenses, salary expenses, so paying their assistant district attorneys, paying the victim witness advocates, paying the investigators and the administrative staff of the office. But they can also work in collaboration with community-based programs to make sure that people who are being diverted to appropriate programs that have a good track record and reputation of successful outcomes. That's something that the district attorney's office can do. They can use their influence with the legislature to go up to the State House and advocate for more funding for restorative justice programming, for justice reinvestment, which is to say the reduction of expenses for incarcerating people can be reinvested in programs that treat and serve people. And the other pool of money that district attorneys can access is through what's called civil asset forfeiture. Essentially, when somebody is arrested and accused of a crime, if they have money on them or if they have any property or other assets that the police believe are associated with that crime, the police can seize that, and then the district attorney's office moves in a civil proceeding, not a criminal proceeding, but a civil proceeding, to forfeit that money. And then they get that money and they split it with the police. More times often than not, district attorney's offices use that money on programming and training for their assistant district attorneys. But I would say that it would be far better to take that money and reinvest all of it in community-based crime prevention alternatives. And currently the district attorney's offices are encouraged to give at least 10% of civil asset forfeiture funds back to community-based crime prevention programs. Some of them do the 10%, a lot of them don't. And there are a few that have gone over the 10%, but the question we have to ask is, what are they spending it on? Because in one county, the district attorney's office paid for a Zamboni machine, which is the big machine that cleans the ice at skating rinks. How is that a community crime?
Impacting your community.
Exactly. And then another one, same county, they redid the athletic fields on the playground. So folks will say, well, that's a good idea because it gives the kids a nice place to play. Right. The problem is that they did that in one of the more affluent sections of the county. So if we're really talking about crime prevention and that using that money to resod or returf fields for kids to play on, let's do it in the section of the city or the community where they have the greatest need for that type of programming.
Okay. Do you think the assistant district attorneys, we know we have young, intelligent attorneys that are working for the office. Do you think they are properly trained when they get a case to make a decision that this program fits for this defendant and this program will work well for whatever this person is going through? Do you think they use these programs accordingly, or what do you think?
I think there are not enough resources to do the work that needs to get done. I reflect on my own experience as an assistant district attorney when I started back in the Suffolk County DA's office in 2000. My first day on the job, I was in the arraignment session, which is where people are first brought after being
Right.
arrested, and when they are first formally informed of the charges against them, and they can enter a plea of guilty or not guilty. In that arraignment session, one of the things that happens, in addition to the charges being formally read, is the prosecutor gets to make a request for bail. And again, as I said earlier, the only purpose for bail is to ensure that somebody returns to court on the next day.
Exactly.
I had no idea what type of request to make or whether or not to make a request. And the attorney that was supervising me said, well, Rahsaan, if you ask 10 different prosecutors, you'll get 10 different answers.
That is true.
I'm several years out of law school, maybe 24, 25 years old at the time. I'm sitting here throwing out $1,000 numbers for people, an amount that I could not even post myself at the time if I was held on bail. And there are people whose lives are in the balance based on a decision that I'm making, and I have no training, no understanding about the complexity of these people's lives and how disruptive bail can be, because when somebody's held on bail, they can lose their job, they can lose their apartment or their housing, they can even lose custody of their children when they're held, and sometimes people are just held on bail because they're too poor. All this to say that there was a dearth of training available to me as an assistant district attorney. And so to get back to your question, do the assistant district attorneys have the type of training to identify the appropriate programming to benefit people? No. They don't have that type of training. To my understanding, that type of training does not even exist right now. And so that is something else that needs to be considered when people are thinking about who they want to elect for district attorney. Is this a person who is going to set office-wide policies and priorities that result in training programs that will help the assistant district attorneys, their line prosecutors, begin to understand and identify what services people need? That isn't something that is exclusively the responsibility of prosecutors, but the district attorney's office does have a role in that.
I think it's very important. I know also you said there's a campaign. Does the campaign target schools, churches, or where do you target and to get people's attention in the community?
Sure, that's a great question, and it's something that we're working out. That's part of the reason I'm so glad to be on your show this morning. Yeah, so our What a Difference a DA Makes campaign, and again, you can find out more about it on our website, www.dadifference.org. Is a public education campaign, and I should also say that it is a nonpartisan, non-electioneering public education campaign. We're not endorsing or supporting any candidates. We're not telling people who to vote for.
Right.
We're laying out a set of values, principles, and beliefs about what district attorneys should be doing, and encouraging people to pay attention to the race and get engaged and turn out and vote. And so what we've been doing through our public education forums is we've been working with different religious congregations, different community groups. There's a presentation that I do, and so if folks are interested in getting a group of community members together, you can reach out to me. My email address is rhall@aclum.org. That's rhall, H-R-A, look, I can't even spell my name.
It's okay, take your time.
HALL@aclum.org, and you can request a public education forum. I just did one the other night out in Berkshire County. I did one on Wednesday at a Jewish congregation, Dorshai Zedek, and so I've been doing them at various locations. The primary way of engagement is through our website platform, dadifference.org. And we've also done court watch training. So we're training people to go into the courts to watch what actually happens. Because again, like I was saying... And the court is a public area where you can go and sit down and just observe. Exactly. And so we want people to go and see what's being done in their name. Because part of what DAs do through their prosecution is connected to public safety. But the narratives around public safety and what that means is very complicated, and it has a deep history tied to this nation's original sin of slavery and genocide, Jim Crow, the war on poverty, the war on crime, the war on drugs, mass incarceration. Public safety is used to define a certain group of people that need to be kept safe from another group of people, and it usually relies on outdated racial stereotypes. Not to say that white people are not impacted by the criminal justice system, because they are. Not to say that they are not incarcerated, because they are. But the majority of energy and conversation around public safety focuses on racialized stereotypes around who are the bad people. And so we want people to do court watch so that they can go into court and see what's being done in their name, and that's a part of our campaign as well. And then we're also going to do canvassing, where we're going out and having people knock on doors. And it's important for us in this work to center and prioritize the life, experience, and voice of formerly incarcerated people, because they are the ones who are most directly impacted by the decision of district attorneys. So we've set some money aside to pay formerly incarcerated people to do canvassing, to get out the vote and help people pay attention to this race. So folks can reach out to us. They can visit our website, DA Difference, to learn more, dadifference.org. You can email me, Rahsaan Hall, at rhall@aclum.org, and we'll do a presentation for any group of people that are interested in learning more about the role, power, and influence of DAs.
I'm really happy that you're here today to just give us an insight about everything, because I think it's very important as a community. We have a voice, and it's very important to use that voice to make a change and a difference within our community. Because if we don't work together, how else are we going to have change? And I feel that, the community needs to know, people in the community needs to know, these are the DAs that are running. Go out there and see what each of them have to offer. This is not an endorsement or anything. This is just to let you know what's going on. And I've always said there's resources, but there's not resources. There's information, but there's not information. And it's not being spread as much as it should be. What do you think, people who are listening in, what advice would you give them when looking at each and every different candidate, and what things to pay attention to?
Sure. This is a challenging question for me, because to the extent that I talk about certain values and principles that folks should look at, people may interpret that as me aligning myself with a particular candidate. But I think the ACLU's public education campaign has been clear from the outset that our platform is a progressive, reform-based program that's focused on empowering and lifting up communities of color and historically oppressed and disenfranchised communities. And so, first of all, I think it's important for voters to educate themselves on the role of district attorney. And so again, visit the website, dadifference.org. They can learn more about it. We also have a section on the website where people can identify the candidates in the contested districts, and we have links to those candidates' websites so they can look at which candidate speaks to the values that they share. We are focusing on reform, so we are looking at people who are not going to exploit the bail system, that they are going to advocate for reforms to bail. We want reforms to civil asset forfeiture, that process I talked about, where they are where prosecutors' offices can seize people's funds. We want people that are committed to racial justice, which is to say, we want to see a candidate who is going to implement specific policies towards reducing the racial disparities that exist. In Massachusetts, blacks and Latinos make up 23% of the state's population. We make up 54% of the people who, or 57% of the people who are incarcerated. But then when you look at people who are serving mandatory minimum drug sentences, that number jumps up to 75%.
Wow.
And that's in the face of evidence that shows that blacks and Latinos use and sell drugs at relatively comparable rates to whites. So it's a question about the way that communities are policed and the priorities that the district attorney sets for their office. So we're looking for people who have a commitment to racial justice. Those are some of the things that we are invested in. More transparency, more accountability, making the data on their prosecution statistics publicly available for the community to see, making protections for immigrants and for people who are undocumented. We have to be mindful of the foreigner that is within our midst, as Scripture tells us, because we were once foreigners as well. And so I think those are some of the things that we are looking at, that we are encouraging folks to pay attention to, and then that they would go out and vote in a way that if those values resonate with them, if they see mass incarceration as a problem, if they see the gross racial disparities that exist in the system as a problem, that they would be able to identify a candidate that has a plan and has expressed the desire to address those issues, that they would go out and vote for those candidates.
I really think we have a wonderful group that's running for the DA's position. Each of them have something to bring to the table. I'm happy each of them have a big background in working in the law system, in the criminal justice system, I should say. And I encourage people to just go and read more about them. Learn what they've done, and try to see which one fits what you're more passionate about. And also, last week, we heard there was like 4 shootings in Roxbury. What can we do as a community to stop these things from reoccurring and over again?
Right. That's a very complicated question, because there's not a panacea. There's not a simple solution to this. I think the role of district attorney looks at in developing community trust, so that people will participate and will be willing to come forward, because for the same people who are victims one day, they may be a defendant the next.
Yes,
and,
right.
And people have lived in communities where they have seen law enforcement and police and DA's offices abuse and mistreat them, and then all of a sudden they're supposed to be cooperative and helpful with the police or with law enforcement, and that's something that needs to change. There needs to be a greater investment in resources and programming and activities for young people, so that they are not involved in this type of deadly behavior. There needs to be a conversation around what we do with young adults between 18 and 24 who have the highest rates of recidivism, and what we understand about brain science development that shows that they need to be in a setting, if they are incarcerated, in a setting that is more age appropriate, so that they don't continue to create or be involved in the same repetitive cycle of violence and crime. So there are a lot of things that need to happen. The DA has a role in mostly all of them. In some instances, it's a more significant role than others.
And lastly, as a man of faith and a reverend, how has your job shaped you as a successful attorney?
Well, I endeavor to do my work every day by asking, what is it that the Lord my God has required of me? And it is to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with our God. And so that's how I strive to do the work that I do. That informs my perspective, as well as the way that I engage and interact with people. It's about justice, and it's about humility before God, and it's about service to God's people.
Thank you so much. And can you tell us if there's any events that's going on that you would like to invite the public?
Sure. There is an event next Tuesday, June 19th at the Lilla G. Frederick Middle School. There are the some NFL players, the Players Association, that are having a conversation with the district attorney candidates. That's not our event, but it is an event that's happening on July 24th in Arlington at the First Parish Unitarian Universalist. They will be having a debate between the Middlesex County District Attorney candidates. On August 23rd, Greater Boston Interfaith Organization is going to be having their action. And please visit our website at dadifference.org.
Thank you again, Rahsaan Hall. It was a pleasure having you here today.
Thank you for having me.